Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're going deep, folks, like really deep.
Oh, are we talking Mariana Trench levels of deep?
You could say that. We're diving into Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations.
Wow, a classic.
A classic, and let's be honest, a bit of a beast of a book, but
Immense. Yeah, I've heard that.
we've got a fantastic podcast episode as our guide, and trust me, we're going to pull out the good stuff.
The stuff that still matters today, not just the history lesson.
Exactly. And speaking of history, this book was published in 1776.
No way. Same year as the Declaration of Independence. What a coincidence.
Right, like revolutionary ideas were just in the air or something.
Maybe so.
Yeah.
So where do we start with this Wealth of Nations thing?
Well, let's jump right into one of the most famous concepts, the division of labor.
Okay, division of labor. Sounds kind of dry.
It's anything but. Smith uses this example of a pin factory to illustrate it, and it's actually super fascinating.
A pin factory. Okay, I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
So picture this. Instead of one person making an entire pin from start to finish.
Which seems logical, right? One person, one pin.
You'd think so, but Smith argues that it's way more efficient to break the process down into smaller tasks.
So like you have one person just drawing out the wire, another straightening it, another cutting it, and so on.
Exactly. And that's the key specialization.
Each person focusing on just one small part of the process.
And that's how you get crazy good at something, right? Practice makes perfect, or at least pretty darn good.
It seems counterintuitive, but Smith says this specialization actually leads to way more pins being produced overall.
More pins, more wealth, hence the title, The Wealth of Nations.
Makes sense. So it's not just about making pins faster, it's about increasing overall production.
Exactly. And this idea applies to way more than just factories. It's a fundamental principle of how we organize work, and even how we think about our own skills and talents.
So, like, if I'm really good at writing, maybe I should focus on that and leave the graphic design to someone else.
Exactly. Play to your strengths. And think about a team project. Dividing the work based on everyone's skills makes the whole thing run smoother.
Yeah, it's like the classic too many cooks in the kitchen scenario.
Exactly. Now, this leads us to another big idea from Smith.
Oh, there are more. I'm already feeling smarter.
This one's called the invisible hand. And the podcast we listened to called it one of the most famous and maybe misunderstood ideas in economics.
Oh, the invisible hand. I've heard that thrown around. Something about markets working their magic, right?
It's kind of like that. Essentially, it's the idea that when people act in their own self-interest.
So like trying to make money, get ahead in life, that sort of thing.
Right. Those actions often end up benefiting society as a whole, even if that wasn't the person's intention.
So it's like a win-win. I get what I want, and society benefits too.
In a lot of cases, yes. The podcast gave the example of an entrepreneur starting a business because they want to make money.
Which is totally fair. Everyone's got to make a living.
Right. But in doing so, they're also creating jobs, providing goods or services that people need, and contributing to the economy.
So their self-interest actually helps the community too.
Exactly. It's like this unseen force guiding things towards a positive outcome, hence the invisible hand.
That's pretty cool. And this isn't just an old-fashioned idea, right? Where do we see this invisible hand at work today?
Oh, it's everywhere. Think about those apps on your phone. The developers created those to make a profit.
And they did. Some of them are making bank.
But in the process, they've created tools that millions of people use every day to connect, learn, and even do business.
So the invisible hand is like the ultimate multitasker, benefiting individuals and society at the same time.
Pretty much. But of course, nothing's ever quite that simple, right? It does make you wonder, are there any situations where this invisible hand doesn't work quite as smoothly?
I mean, the world's a complicated place, so I'm guessing there must be.
Definitely. And that's where things get a bit more nuanced. Smith wasn't arguing that people should just be totally selfish and everything will magically work out.
Yeah, that sounds a bit too good to be true.
He recognized that there needs to be some boundaries, some rules of the game.
So it's not a free-for-all. There's still a role for government, right?
Absolutely. Smith believed in free markets, but he wasn't what you'd call a free market zealot.
Okay, so where did he draw the line?
He saw a role for government in providing things that markets might not do so well on their own, things like infrastructure, education, and defense.
The essentials, basically.
Yeah.
Stuff that we all need, but maybe wouldn't necessarily pop up naturally in a purely market-driven world.
Exactly. Imagine trying to rely on individual businesses to build and maintain all the highways in a country.
That would be chaos.
Mm.
Everyone building their own little toll roads going in different directions.
Exactly. And the same with education, leaving it purely to the market could create huge inequalities in who gets access to learning.
So the invisible hand needs a helping hand sometimes, especially when it comes to things that benefit everyone.
It's all about finding that balance between individual freedom and the need for some level of regulation to ensure that everyone has a fair shot.
Makes sense. So Smith was basically saying, let the markets do their thing, but let's also have some rules in place to make sure things don't get out of hand.
That's a pretty good summary. And this debate about the role of government, it's still going strong today, right? Think about healthcare, regulating big tech companies, all those hot button issues.
It's like we're still wrestling with the same question Smith was asking centuries ago. It's amazing how relevant his ideas still are.
It really is. And speaking of relevant, there's another area where Smith had some pretty forward-thinking ideas.
Ooh, what's that?
Taxes.
Taxes. Not exactly the most exciting topic.
I know, but hear me out. Smith was a big advocate for what's called progressive taxation.
Progressive taxation. Refresh my memory. What's that again?
It basically means that people who earn more should pay a higher percentage of their income in taxes.
So not everyone pays the same flat rate.
Exactly. And that's a core principle of how many modern tax systems work today.
Huh. So he was ahead of his time in that way.
He was. But he also understood that taxes should be fair and efficient.
Meaning they shouldn't be so high that they discourage people from working and creating wealth.
Right. It's all about finding that sweet spot, that balance between generating revenue for the government and allowing individuals and businesses to thrive.
It sounds like Smith was really good at seeing both sides of the coin, recognizing the complexity of these issues.
He was. Now, I know we're here to talk about the big ideas, but the podcast we're using as our guide also included some fun little stories about Adam Smith himself, and it turns out
All right, there's gossip. I love gossip.
he was a bit of a character. Apparently, he was known for being quite absent-minded.
Oh, like the stereotypical professor lost in thought and bumping into things.
Exactly. There's this story about him wandering around Edinburgh in his dressing gown, completely lost in his own world.
I can totally picture that. What else?
And get this, he once fell into a tanning pit because he was so engrossed in a conversation that he wasn't paying attention to where he was going.
Oh, no. I hope he was okay.
He was fine, but it just goes to show how deep in thought he could get. But the biggest surprise of all,
Do tell.
there's reason to believe he never actually visited a pin factory.
Wait, what? The whole foundation of his division of labor argument? And he might have never even seen it in action.
It seems that way. It's thought that he based his description on secondhand accounts, but it's still a pretty powerful and enduring image.
So even though he was a bit of an absent-minded professor, his ideas were still spot on.
It shows you the power of observation and deduction, even without first-hand experience, and that's what makes The Wealth of Nations so fascinating.
It's not just some dry textbook. It's a product of this brilliant, quirky mind that was trying to make sense of the world.
Exactly. And those insights into human behavior and how economies work, they're still incredibly relevant today.
So even if we don't all end up falling into tanning pits, there's a lot we can learn from Adam Smith.
Absolutely. And before we move on to even more fascinating stuff from The Wealth of Nations, we'll be right back after a quick. We were just talking about how sharp Adam Smith was, even if he did have a tendency to, wander off into his own little world.
A bit of a daydreamer, but hey, those daydreams led to some pretty groundbreaking ideas.
They did. And speaking of those ideas, the podcast we're using for this deep dive mentioned something really interesting, the inscription on Smith's grave.
Oh yeah, I read about that. Pretty profound stuff.
It says, by pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of the society.
It's like the ultimate summary of the invisible hand, right? Just a few words, but it gets right to the core of his thinking.
It really does. But it also makes you think, is that always true? Does pursuing your own self-interest always lead to good things for everyone?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I mean, it's a nice idea in theory, but the world's a messy place.
Right. Because we all know that sometimes people being selfish can actually lead to some pretty bad outcomes.
Yeah, like companies polluting the environment just to make an extra buck, or cutting corners on safety to boost their profits.
Exactly. So it's not quite as simple as saying, everyone be selfish and everything will work out.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the areas where Smith's ideas maybe need a little bit of an update for the 21st century.
Oh, how so?
Well, he was writing at a time when economies were much smaller, much more localized.
So the impact of any one person's actions was probably less widespread.
Exactly. But now we're all so interconnected, it's like a butterfly flapping its wings in one part of the world can cause a hurricane on the other side.
It's a bit dramatic, but you get the point. Like, think about climate change. One person driving their car might not seem like a big deal.
But when you multiply that by billions of people, suddenly it's a global crisis.
And that raises some interesting questions about how the invisible hand works in a world where the stakes are so much higher.
Right. Can we really rely on individual self-interest to solve problems that require collective action on a global scale?
It seems like maybe the invisible hand needs a little help sometimes.
A little nudge in the right direction.
Maybe some guidance from governments or international organizations to make sure we're all moving towards a common goal.
That's one approach. Some economists argue that we need targeted regulations and incentives to align self-interest with the greater good.
So you're not trying to eliminate self-interest altogether, but
Yes.
you're trying to channel it in a way that benefits everyone.
Yeah, it's like harnessing that energy for good, making it work for us instead of against us.
It's like, if we know that people are going to act in their own self-interest anyway, let's create a system where doing so also happens to be the best thing for the planet and for society.
Exactly. And there are a lot of different ways to do that. Things like carbon taxes, subsidies for renewable energy, even just public awareness campaigns can make a difference.
So it's not about choosing between free markets and government intervention. It's about finding the right mix of both.
It's about recognizing that they both have their strengths and weaknesses and finding ways to make them work together.
It's that balance again, isn't it? That seems to be a recurring theme in Smith's work.
It is. And I think it's a really important lesson for us today as we face all these complex challenges, from climate change to inequality to technological disruption.
We can't just rely on simple solutions. We need to be willing to think critically, to experiment, and to adapt our approaches as we learn more.
And that's why Smith's work is so valuable, even centuries later. He gives us a framework for thinking about these issues in a nuanced and sophisticated way.
He reminds us that economics is ultimately about people, and that finding solutions requires understanding human behavior and motivations.
It's not just about crunching numbers and looking at charts and graphs. It's about understanding how people make decisions and how those decisions ripple out and impact the world around us.
So even though The Wealth of Nations can seem like a pretty dense and intimidating book, I think there's a lot in there that can help us navigate the challenges of the 21st century.
I agree. It's like a roadmap, but not a roadmap that tells you exactly where to go. More like a roadmap that gives you the tools to figure out your own path.
And sometimes the best path is the one you create yourself, based on the knowledge and insights you've gathered along the way.
That's a great way to put it. And I think Adam Smith would approve of that message. He was all about empowering individuals to make their own choices and shape their own destinies.
Speaking of choices, one choice I'm glad I made was to dive into The Wealth of Nations with you today. It's been a fascinating journey.
Me too. Who knew talking about economics could be so much fun?
Well, I think it's all about the company you keep. But before we wrap things up, I did want to touch on one more thing that the podcast mentioned.
What's that?
It's about Adam Smith, the man, not just the economist.
Oh, right. We were talking about how he was a bit of a character earlier. Anything else juicy we should know?
Well, it turns out that he wasn't just this cold, calculating economic genius.
I mean, falling into a tanning pit doesn't exactly scream cold and calculating.
True. But more importantly, the podcast highlighted the fact that he was also a moral philosopher.
Oh, right. He wrote that other famous book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments.
Exactly. So he wasn't just interested in how economies worked, he was also deeply concerned with ethics, empathy, and what it means to be a good person.
That adds a whole other layer to his work, doesn't it? It's not just about maximizing wealth, it's about creating a society where people can flourish and live meaningful lives.
It's like he was trying to understand the human condition in all its complexity, and not just the economic side of things.
And that makes his work even more relevant to the challenges we're facing today.
Because those challenges aren't just economic, they're also ethical, social, and environmental.
It's all interconnected, and I think Smith understood that better than most.
He was a visionary in that way. So even though he lived centuries ago, his ideas still have a lot to teach us about how to create a better world.
A world where we can all pursue our own interests while also contributing to the common good.
A world where the invisible hand and the helping hand can work together to guide us towards a brighter future.
That's a beautiful thought, and I think that's a perfect place to leave it for today.
I agree. But before we go, We do have one final thought-provoking question for our listeners, something to ponder as you continue your day.
Ooh, I love these brain teasers.
This one comes straight from Adam Smith's grave. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of the society. Now, is this always true? Are there limits to this principle? What are the ethical implications of pursuing self-interest in a world that's as complex and interconnected as ours?
Those are some big questions. I don't know if I have the answers, but they're definitely worth thinking about.
Me neither. But that's the beauty of it, isn't it? Adam Smith's work invites us to engage in these conversations, to think critically, and to challenge our own assumptions.
It's a journey, not a destination.
Well said. And on that note, we'll leave you to continue your own exploration of Adam Smith's world. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. Until next time. It really makes you think about all the different ways those few words can be interpreted.
It does, doesn't it? It's like a whole philosophy packed into one sentence.
And it highlights this tension that we've been talking about between individual freedom and the need for some sort of collective good.
Right, because on the one hand, you want to encourage people to be innovative, to take risks, to pursue their own goals.
But on the other hand, you don't want that to come at the expense of others or of the planet.
Exactly. And that's the challenge, finding that balance between individual ambition and social responsibility.
It's like, how do you create a system where people are free to pursue their own interests, but also incentivized to make choices that benefit everyone?
That's the big question.
Yeah.
And there's no easy answer.
Right.
But I think one approach that's gained a lot of traction in recent years is this idea of nudging.
Nudging. Like you're not forcing people to do anything, but you're sort of gently guiding them in a certain direction.
Exactly. It's about using insights from behavioral economics and psychology to design policies or incentives that make it easier for people to make choices that are good for them and good for society.
So it's like you're playing to people's self-interest, but you're also kind of subtly shaping the choices that are available to them.
Right, because we all know that people aren't always perfectly rational actors. We're influenced by all sorts of biases and emotions.
We're human, after all.
Exactly. So nudging is about recognizing those human quirks and using them to our advantage.
Can you give an example of how this works in practice?
Sure. One classic example is retirement savings. A lot of people know they should be saving for retirement, but they just never get around to it.
Procrastination, it's a real thing.
It is. So some companies have started automatically enrolling their employees in retirement plans with the option to opt out if they want to.
So you have to make an active choice to not save, instead of having to make an active choice to start saving.
Exactly. And you know what? It's made a huge difference. Studies have shown that this one simple change has led to a significant increase in retirement savings.
That's amazing. Just by tweaking the default option, you can have a big impact on people's behavior.
And it doesn't feel coercive. People still have the freedom to choose, but you're making it easier for them to make the choice that's ultimately in their best interest.
It's like you're giving the invisible hand a little bit of a helping hand.
Exactly. And I think that's something that Adam Smith would have appreciated, even though he's often associated with this idea of laissez-faire economics.
Right, the whole let the market do its thing philosophy.
But if you actually read The Wealth of Nations carefully, you'll see that Smith was a lot more nuanced in his thinking.
He wasn't opposed to all forms of government intervention, was he?
Not at all. He actually saw a role for government in providing certain public goods, like education and infrastructure, and also in regulating markets to prevent things like monopolies and fraud.
So it's not about choosing sides. It's about recognizing that both markets and governments have their strengths and limitations.
And finding the right balance between the two, depending on the specific circumstances.
Balance, there's that word again.
It's all about balance.
Huh.
And I think that's one of the most important lessons we can take away from Adam Smith's work.
That there's no one-size-fits-all solution, that we need to be flexible and adaptable in our thinking.
And that we need to be willing to challenge our own assumptions and biases.
And that's what makes economics so fascinating, right? It's not just about crunching numbers. It's about understanding human behavior, motivations, and the complex interplay of forces that shape our world.
It's about asking tough questions and being open to new ideas.
And on that note, I think it's time for us to wrap up this deep dive into the wealth of nations.
It's been quite a journey. I feel like I've learned so much.
Me too. And to all our listeners out there, if you're feeling inspired to learn more, we highly recommend picking up a copy of The Wealth of Nations.
It can be a bit dense, But it's worth the effort, even if you just start with a few chapters.
And there are also tons of great resources available online and in libraries, from summaries and study guides to podcasts and documentaries.
So don't be intimidated. Dive in and explore Adam Smith's world.
As you go about your day, keep those big questions in mind. Where do you see the invisible hand at work? What role should government play in the economy? And how can we create a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive?
Those are questions worth pondering, and I think Adam Smith would be happy to know that we're still wrestling with them centuries later.
Because it means his work is still relevant, still challenging us to think deeply about the world around us.
And that's the mark of a truly great thinker, someone whose ideas continue to resonate across generations.
So thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Adam Smith. And until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.